It's a busy day for Donald Trump ahead of what will be a very consequential week for the criminally convicted former president and the country. In less than an hour, Trump will take the stage in Philadelphia for his last rally before his first 2024 debate with President Biden in Atlanta on Thursday. Earlier today, Trump addressed the conservative Faith and Freedom Coalition, where he praised mobsters and railed against the justice system.
The weaponization of law enforcement is the greatest threat to freedom in America today, I think, and nobody knows it better than me. The late, great Al Capone, right? I tell it all the time, Scarface. He didn't go through what I went through. I got indicted more than him, sir. For nothing, for no crimes.
Trump also repeated his usual lies about voter fraud just days before the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The High Court's right-wing supermajority agreed to hear Trump's presidential immunity claim more than 3 months ago, and its long-delayed decision is already a victory for Trump. Trump's federal election interference trial has gone from a March start date to legal limbo as the lower court and the rest of us await the Supreme Court's decision. And with each passing day, it becomes less and less likely that before the next election, Donald Trump will be held accountable for trying to overturn the last one. Former Supreme Court clerk Leah Littman says the justices' dithering about Trump is far more than fishy. It's rotten. She writes in the New York Times, quote, "There are, of course, explanations that have nothing to do with politics for why a ruling still hasn't been issued. But the reasons to think something is rotten at the court are impossible to ignore." Littman calls Trump's arguments for immunity, quote, "outlandish," especially the idea that a president would have to have an impeachment conviction before they could be punished for any crime. As a reminder, this is what Trump's lawyers said back in April about whether a commander-in-chief could get away with murder.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
It could.
Okay, look, I'm no lawyer, but you'd think it would take less than 58 days to rule that nonsense unconstitutional. Joining me now, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer for Slate, and Leah Littman, professor at the University of Michigan Law School and former Supreme Court law clerk, who is also co-host of the podcast Strict Scrutiny. Thank you both very much for coming to the Saturday show. So, Leah, let me go back to something you wrote in the New York Times. You wrote, "There are, of course, explanations that have nothing to do with politics for why a ruling still hasn't been issued in the presidential immunity case." What could those explanations be?
So possible good faith explanations include things like, look, the case was argued in April and the Supreme Court still has cases outstanding from when they heard arguments in December. Just yesterday, it resolved a case that had been argued in November. So it's not surprising that a case argued in April would kind of fall to the bottom of the barrel as far as cases that end up being resolved closer to the term. But there are also so many reasons to think that just isn't sufficient to explain what's going on here, in particular, given how quickly they resolved the Colorado disqualification case in favor of Donald Trump. There, they quickly restored Donald Trump to the ballot in time for Super Tuesday, and they did so within 50 days or 50-some days of actually deciding to hear the case. And here, it's been over 100 days since they decided to take the immunity case, and Jack Smith had actually asked them to take it up 2 months before that. So they have been delaying this case and acted much more quickly in many others.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, I just want to drill down on something, because the immunity question boils down to the definition of official acts. So where do you think the justices will draw the line on that?
So, look, I think this is going to be a muddled decision that doesn't give a clear victory to either side. I think the three liberals would love to give a clear victory to Jack Smith. They think that all of this is ridiculous nonsense with no basis in the Constitution. I tend to agree with them. But Chief Justice John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett were looking for some kind of compromise during oral arguments. So I think what they'll end up doing is send this back down to the lower court and have her parse the difference in the acts that Trump is alleged to have committed here, whether it's official within his presidential duties or unofficial, like, for instance, trying to create a slate of fake electors who would give Trump an illegitimate majority in the Electoral College. Two problems with that. First, it's going to run out the clock even more. That's going to take months in the lower courts, if not even longer. There will be an appeal that'll end back up at SCOTUS. But also, and I think this is crucial, it really takes the heart out of Jack Smith's case, right? The whole argument here that the special prosecutor has brought is that the president weaponized his constitutional powers in order to halt the peaceful transition of power to a new president and essentially stand in the way of democracy. That should be, in the view of the special counsel of the United States government, that should be a criminal offense. We should be able to put that in front of a jury and say this man committed a crime. But what the Supreme Court may well end up doing in order to salvage part of this case is to say, well, anything Trump did that fell under his constitutional authority, even if he was misusing that authority in an anti-constitutional way, that receives some kind of protection. In short, get ready for a big mess.
I mean, Leah, listening to Mark, I'm sitting here thinking that the legitimacy, if the court does what Mark is predicting, the legitimacy of the court will be supremely, no pun intended, supremely in question. And I want to come back to also something you wrote in the New York Times where you said, this whole thing is rotten in terms of the delay in the immunity case. What is the evidence of something rotten? And does it get to the overall problem of the legitimacy in the eyes of the public, the legitimacy of the court?
So there's so much wrong. I don't want to take up your entire program. But, one thing is that they have managed to act much more quickly, as I was noting, in cases that benefited Donald Trump and also the Republican Party. If you think back to when challengers challenged the President Biden's test or vaccination program, the court managed to rule on that within 2 weeks. So that was a divided decision. And yet they managed to get that one out. So even if there is disagreement in the immunity decision, that doesn't actually explain why it is taking so much longer than other decisions that have engendered disagreement. And again, they managed to affect the timing in ways that seem to benefit one side versus the other.
Right.
And
okay, so let me stop you right there, Leah, because the question I was trying to get to is, as a result of all this, do you think Chief Justice Roberts has lost control of the court?
Absolutely. I mean, look at how his colleagues are behaving. You have Justice Alito practically thumbing his nose at democracy, law, and everything else that should matter to this country. And the Chief Justice isn't really in a position to do anything about it, or at least he hasn't even attempted to. Because some of the other evidence for why we should think something is wrong at the court is, of course, the fact that Justice Alito's homes displayed multiple flags associated with the Stop the Steal movement, which, of course, is also behind the Trump immunity claim, as well as another January 6th case that is outstanding at the Supreme Court that could take away some of the additional charges in the election interference case against Donald Trump. So, yes, it seems as though the Chief Justice has lost control of this court, or at least he has not done nearly enough to rein it in. As to whether this is going to affect the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the eyes of the public, I guess from my perspective, my concern is that the media might translate a split ruling of the kind that Mark was describing as a compromise or a middle-of-the-road balance, when in reality, it would decline to reject a completely outlandish position and in the process hand Donald Trump a significant victory by allowing him to continue to run out the clock and prevent a jury of his peers from deciding whether he engaged in illegal election interference.
Mark, let me get you on one more thing about something you wrote about in the Rahimi decision, and that's the great 8-1 decision that said, oh my, domestic abusers should not be able to have guns. Great decision. But you write, the headline of your piece is why Rahimi decision of preventing domestic abusers to own guns isn't all good news. Real quick.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Supreme Court did not foreclose future wacky Second Amendment challenges to common sense gun restrictions. The court left the door open and said, well, this one goes too far. We're not going to arm domestic abusers today. But it declined to walk back its broader loony and I think anti-historical position on a very robust individual right to bear arms. I'll also say this case gave the conservative justices an opportunity to walk back some of their extremism on originalism. And a few of them kind of took it, but none of them acknowledged that they were the reason that lower courts had issued this rash of wacky decisions like the one at issue, arming domestic abusers. None of the conservatives would say, yeah, we got it wrong. We went too far. We used unworkable tests and language and bad history, and we need to take a clear, more legible approach to the law. They would not admit a single bit of fault. And so that suggests to me they aren't really chastened. They say, yeah, we'll be the adults in the room when we need to, but they will continue to let the lower courts run wild when it comes to trampling all over common sense gun safety laws.
Threats against lawmakers are on the rise again after hitting an all-time high in 2021 when Donald Trump's followers stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Last year, the Capitol Police investigated more than 8,000 threats against members of Congress, an increase from 2022. A spokesman for the department predicted 2024 will be, quote, a very busy year for our special agents. This week, a Texas man who vowed to kill Congresswoman Maxine Waters was sentenced to 33 months in prison and a $10,000 fine. The man left Waters voicemails with violent and racist threats in 2022 and doubled down when police warned him to stop. Congresswoman Waters attended the man's sentencing hearing. She told the court the threats gave her nightmares. It made her and her family fear for their lives. The Los Angeles Times reported that the Congresswoman described herself as, quote, haunted. Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters of California. She's the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman Waters, as always, thank you for coming to the Saturday show. You've been in the public eye for decades. Why were these threats particularly painful?
Well, you know, it was sinister. Here was a man who continued to call 4 times, and he made racial comments. He basically said not only was he going to put a bullet between my eyes, he was going to cut my throat. And I want to tell you, it did get to me. I'm not someone who walks around, you know, just fearful all the time. But this was more sinister again. It was deadly. And so I am haunted by those kinds of comments coming from him.
Congresswoman, what made you want to face your harasser in court?
I wanted to see who this human being was. And when he saw me, what was it about me that made him want to kill me? What had I said? What did I do that made him want to slit my throat or to put a bullet between my eyes? And so I listened to him, and I hope he listened to me. I had my children in court with me. My daughter was there. My son was there. And they're always fearful that I'm going to be killed. And of course, my staff has to endure these kinds of threats. This isn't the first one we've had. We've had some others sentenced and put in jail, but this one seems more consistent and seemed more serious. Again, it seems as if this man was intent on not only threatening me, but he said he had people in the Los Angeles area, some of his friends or groups of people that he works with that were going to get me, that they had a contract out on my life.
How concerned are you, Congresswoman, about your safety if Donald Trump is reelected?
Well, I'm very concerned, not only about my safety and not only about the safety of members of Congress. I'm concerned about the safety of so many people in this country, particularly people of color. Trump has said that if he does not win, it's going to be fraud. And because it's going to be fraud, there's going to be blood in the streets. He threatens about a civil war, and he threatens there's going to be violence. So I say all of this talk is motivational with many of those who are racist, who are sitting at home listening to him, and they're taking him up on his threats even before the elections take place. And so it's about thousands, maybe millions of people, being threatened and being at risk because of Donald Trump and his desire to wreak revenge on anything and everybody.
Congressman, real quickly, in the less than 2 minutes we have left, 60 years ago this week, 3 activists, Mikey Schwerner, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, they were murdered for trying to register Black Mississippi residents to vote during Freedom Summer. What do you see as their legacy today, especially as the nation faces more threats of political violence like the ones you've faced?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of those people who joined in the civil rights movement, who are not Black, who are not people of color, who joined with us to try and get justice and equality in this country. But we see they were killed, they were murdered. And I do believe that, having listened to Donald Trump so many times and having the attack, the insurrection that took place on the House of Representatives, in Congress, on the Capitol grounds, that we could be in for more killings like that. And I think Donald Trump has to take responsibility for what he's saying about blood in the streets and violence if he's not elected to be the president of the United States of America.
Buckle up. This week could be a wild ride and a critical turning point in the race for the White House. On Thursday in Atlanta, President Biden and Donald Trump will face off on the debate stage for the first time since October of 2020. That's actually the last time they've been in the same room. It will also be the first ever debate between a sitting president and a twice impeached former president who's been convicted of felony crimes. Guy on the right. Trump is also awaiting trial on 3 other federal indictments, in case you're following along at home. And the pre-debate drama is building. Last night at a rally in Philadelphia, the disgraced former president repeated the ridiculous and false accusation that Biden plans on using performance-enhancing drugs before the debate.
So a little before debate time, he gets a shot in the ass, and they want to strengthen him up. So he comes out, he'll come out, I say he'll come out all jacked up, right?
For real? With nonsense like this, perhaps it's a good thing there are new debate rules that could rein him in. The 90-minute matchup will take place in a TV studio with no audience, and each candidate will have his microphone muted until it's his turn to speak. But who are we kidding? You know, I know, we all know that a muted mic won't keep Trump quiet. The Biden campaign already seems to be preparing for that.
I mean, who knows what Donald Trump is going to do at any minute or any time. I'm going to bet that he's going to talk over the microphone 100 times like he does because he's a bully. But the best way to fight a bully is to stand up to him. And Joe Biden has done that before. He's going to do it again.
Yesterday, Trump told NBC News that he has, quote, no strategy for this debate except to, quote, make America great again. Translation, I'ma wing it. As for President Biden, he's immersed in debate prep at Camp David with advisors, including his personal attorney, Bob Bauer, who will once again play Trump in mock debates. In an interview with me yesterday, Bauer described preparations as, quote, an attempt to really give the opponent a feel for what they would likely face. And if past is prologue, we know what to expect from Trump. Utter chaos, like the kind that prompted this response from Biden at a 2020 debate.
Vote now.
You're gonna pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're a
to answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
would you answer that
because
question?
the question
you want to put a
is
lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is
justice,
the
radical
question-
left.
Will you
Who
shut
is your-
up, man?
Listen.
Trump's annoying tactics are nothing new. Back in 2016, during his second presidential debate against Hillary Clinton, Trump stalked her around the stage like a malevolent land shark as she addressed voters. And his childlike behavior continued in their third debate during a heated discussion about Russian President Vladimir Putin.
From everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
So with that kind of petulant, unhinged behavior coming at you, how do you even begin to prepare? My next guest is the perfect person to answer this question. Joining me now, Philippe Reines, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and former spokesman for Secretary Hillary Clinton. He also played Donald Trump in Hillary Clinton's 2016 mock debate sessions. Philippe, welcome back to the Sunday Show.
Thank you.
Two things we need to talk about. First thing, this accusation that President Biden is going to use performance-enhancing drugs, this is not new. He did this. Trump made the same accusation against Hillary Clinton in 2016, calling for her to take
and he did it after State of the Union. And the real reason he's doing it is because he very stupidly, along with his campaign and the Republican Party and the right wing writ large, has gone with this talking point that Joe Biden can't stand up straight for 90 minutes, that he's going to fall over at the podium. And they're realizing that that's actually not a good thing to keep saying, because that's not what's going to happen. So now, with a few days left, he's trying to do this 180 to explain why, he's going to be perky and really good. It's the same exact thing after the State of the Union. They didn't think he would make it through 75 minutes. Not only did he make it, he knocked it out of the park. And they sit there and they think, uh-oh.
You know, as we go head into Thursday, and the president's at Camp David and he is hunkering down and he's preparing. How has Trump changed since you prepared Hillary Clinton for a debate?
Well, so in 2016, I would start with the fact that his campaigns have changed in the sense of what his message is. Because ultimately, a debate, while it's in front of the largest audience you'll be speaking to during the general election campaign, it really should be consistent with what you're saying day to day. In 2016, fundamentally, he was talking about immigration. He was talking about Obamacare. He was talking about jobs going south. Obviously, he was attacking Hillary left and right. But there was a consistency between his debate performance and his campaign message. If you fast forward to 2020, the guy had no message. He was just an angry, angry man. He was constantly aggrieved. He was upset about Russia. He was upset about COVID. And, you know, the shut up moment was well-deserved because he just was a malfunctioning appliance that was spewing all these things. So the question is, you know, some people say which Donald Trump shows up. There's only one. And he's right. He doesn't have a strategy. What he has is a list. He has a list of things that are always on his mind, always pent up, because you pointed out a really important part of this. They haven't seen each other for more than 1,300 days, and they really don't like each other. Think about how that works for someone you don't like.
Oh, please. Somebody I don't like, they are dead to me.
So there's three parts. There's what he complained about in 2016, what he complained about in 2020 about his first term.
Right.
There's what he complains about now about his trials and about being gagged, and I'm sure he's going to complain about being muted, pretending he didn't know. But then there's a third bucket of policy. Not that he has suddenly, immersed himself in the minutia, but I believe he thinks one way to go at the president is to throw numbers and data that are probably lies,
right,
and just throw data at the wall, hoping that it overwhelms the president. That's what I would guess. Now, the thing with the list is he doesn't have an order, so you don't know what comes out when.
So in an interview you did with Politico in January of 2021, so in the lead up to,
something.
Yeah, something. It talks about the lengths you went to prepare to be Donald Trump. You wore 3-inch heels so that you could raise your height. You wore knee pads and a back brace to be straight, big suits and everything. And another thing you did after watching hours upon hours of tape of Donald Trump is that you noticed he never makes eye contact. And that with Secretary Clinton, in one debate session, you did not look at her for 5 straight hours. What was the significance of that?
He's fundamentally a coward. I mean, if you look at Mitch Landers saying that the way to deal with a bully is to fight back, that is what he does. And part of that is he has a hard time going at some of the personal stuff. Yes, in 2020, he went at the president about his brother and about Hunter on the conspiracy stuff and digressed into some other stuff. But generally, he is a coward, and he shies away from it. And I think the president, if you really want to understand what Thursday night's going to be look at 2020, the first debate. It's going to be probably Joe Biden similar, strong, vigorous, having stuff to say about what I've done for you and what we're going to do together going forward. And just listen to this guy malfunction. But there is this element, we haven't had two presidents in 134 years try to steal each other's job back and forth. And their terms, it's like a baton. The economic numbers overlap. They can shape these, they can present these, they can carve these in all sorts of ways. Like you could have the smartest economists up there and they wouldn't be short. And that's why it's, as an aside, and then I'll stop, is the muting actually might help the moderators more than anyone, because it'll give them a moment or 90 seconds to just retreat into silence. And did he just say that about inflation? Because I want to follow up on that.
All right, real fast, because we're out of time. There's something else that was pretty interesting in that Politico interview, and I'm quoting here. Today, Reines takes great pride in being able to predict what Trump might say, do, or tweet before he does it. And it says, your former colleagues say it was uncanny watching you nail moments in debates before they happen. Do you still have that ability?
Well, I had an advantage because I was a New Yorker, but also in 2016, no one was really paying attention. They thought he was a joke until he wasn't. He is the most predictable, unpredictable person. I think it's pretty safe to say he is going to complain about the muting situation, even though his campaign agreed to it, even though the moderators 20 minutes earlier will have said the campaigns agreed to this. He's not, it's easy to say what he's going to do. And there's things that, I would, if I were him, I would do that I don't want to say out loud.
Please don't.
Also, it's helpful in that story, as you saw. It's helpful if I don't take my medication to fully channel him.
And one other thing that's mentioned in that Politico interview from 2021 is that you pointed out to the campaign that he complained about his mic during his own campaign.
He had been doing that in primaries, and, he has been complaining about teleprompters recently. He has this thing about complaining about technical aspects of his appearances as yet another way of being aggrieved. They're coming after me to jail me. They are trying to gag me. They are muting me. How am I supposed to, what is Joe afraid of? Let me speak.
I'm sure that's exactly what we're going to hear on Thursday night in Atlanta. Philippe Reines, thank you very much for coming to the Sunday show.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.